In the early years of the 19th century, before the road was widened and before the river was redirected, the house already stood where it would remain for more than a century. It was not grand, it was not small, it was simply there, settled into the land as if it had grown from it. The people who owned it spoke often about legacy. They liked the sound of the word. It suggested continuity, order, something that outlived the body. The man who ruled the house in those years believed himself to be reasonable, even progressive by the standards of his neighbors. He did not raise his voice unnecessarily. He did not drink to excess. He believed cruelty was inefficient. That belief would later be mistaken for kindness. The Black family arrived on a gray morning, carried not by ceremony but by routine. There was no spectacle, no gathering of neighbors, no announcement, just a wagon that stopped near the side entrance, and 4 people who stepped down quietly, as if already aware that sound itself could be a liability. A man, a woman, 2 children, one old enough to remember where they had come from, one too young to know the difference. They were not chained. That detail would later be repeated by those who defended the household. They were not beaten upon arrival. They were given clothes that fit. They were shown where to sleep, and they were told the rules. The rules were not written. They were not spoken all at once. They emerged gradually, revealed through correction rather than instruction. Where to stand, when to speak, when silence was expected, and when silence was suspicious. The woman of the house took particular interest in the children. She insisted they be kept clean, that their hair be tended properly. She corrected their posture. She discouraged the sort of play that involved noise or running. They should grow up properly, she said, as though that settled the matter. The children learned quickly that properly meant near, but never with. Meals illustrated this better than anything else. They ate indoors, which was unusual enough to be remarked upon by visitors, but they did not eat at the same time. They did not sit at the table. They waited, often standing, until the plates returned with what remained. Not scraps, the word scraps implied carelessness, but leftovers, portions chosen for them by someone else. This arrangement was spoken of as generosity. The man of the Black family, whose name was shortened because the full version made the household uncomfortable, understood the arrangement immediately. He had lived long enough to recognize systems that disguised themselves as favors. He did not resist. Resistance was visible. Visibility invited correction. Instead, he made himself useful. He fixed what broke. He learned the rhythms of the house. He anticipated needs before they were voiced. This was noticed. Quiet competence always is. Soon he was no longer given instructions so much as expectations. If something went wrong, it was assumed he would resolve it. If something went right, it was assumed it would continue. This, too, would later be described as trust. The woman of the Black family adapted differently. She became small in ways that had nothing to do with posture. She spoke less each year. She learned which expressions drew attention and which allowed her to pass unnoticed. Her care was directed inward, toward the children whom she trained with a precision that looked to an outsider like devotion. She taught them what not to ask, what not to touch, what not to imagine. The older child remembered fields beyond the property, remembered other voices, remembered nights where the horizon did not end at the fence. These memories caused problems. They surfaced at inopportune moments, slipped into questions that had no safe answers. The younger child remembered only the house. This distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Inside the White family, life proceeded as expected. Births, deaths, inheritances discussed over dinner, plans for the future that assumed the present would hold steady. And the present did hold steady, because it was being held. Visitors came and went. Some noticed the black family and commented on how fortunate they seemed. Others barely registered them at all. A few felt a flicker of unease they could not name, and quickly dismissed it. Discomfort, after all, demanded explanation, and explanation demanded responsibility. It was easier to admire the order of the household and move on.
By the end of the first decade, the black family was no longer described as new. They were referred to as part of the house, not quite furniture, not quite people in their own right, something in between, stable and expected. Children in the white family grew accustomed to their presence. They issued commands without thinking, accepted care without gratitude, learned early that certain voices responded and others decided. No one called this teaching, no one called it inheritance, and yet something was already being passed down. At night, when the house settled and the lamps dimmed, the black man sometimes stood at the window assigned to him and looked out toward the darkened road. He did not speak of escape. Escape required a destination. What he felt was not hope or despair, but calculation. He was counting years, not forward, backward, measuring how long it had taken for the house to forget that he and his family had ever arrived. By 1820, that forgetting was nearly complete, and when a system becomes invisible, it becomes durable.
By the time the second decade passed, the house no longer remembered a version of itself without them. This is how permanence works. It does not announce itself. It settles quietly, like dust, until removal feels disruptive. The black family no longer arrived each morning. They were already there. Their footsteps blended into the house's rhythm. Their presence required no acknowledgement. They existed in the way beams exist behind walls, essential, unseen, unquestioned. The white children grew. So did the black children. This is where the story changes shape. They were raised side by side, close enough that their shadows overlapped, yet separated by rules so precise they rarely needed enforcement. The children learned them the way one learns gravity, not through explanation, but through consequence. They played in the same yard, but not the same games. They read from the same books, but not for the same reasons. They listened to the same lessons, but not for the same future. The white children were educated so they could decide. The black children were educated so they could comply. This distinction was never spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. The white matriarch insisted the black children learn to read. This fact would later be cited as proof of her generosity. She supervised their lessons personally at first, correcting pronunciation, adjusting posture, reminding them to sit still. "You must learn properly," she said. Properly meant without opinion. As the years passed, the lessons continued without her presence. The black children learned to read letters, contracts, scripture. They learned to write neatly. They learned to count. But they were never taught what to do with knowledge beyond its usefulness to the house. Curiosity was tolerated only when it aligned with service. When the older black child asked once about land beyond the fence, land owned by no one in particular, the question was answered with a smile that did not reach the eyes. "That's not for you to worry about," the man of the house said calmly. "Everything you need is here." The sentence carried weight because it was true in the narrowest sense. Food was here, shelter was here, safety, as defined by predictability, was here. What lay beyond was undefined, and undefined things are frightening to those raised carefully. By the 1830s, the original black man moved more slowly. His hands were still steady, but his back bent under years of work that was not described as labor, but as responsibility. He trained the younger generation not through instruction, but through demonstration. He showed them how to anticipate displeasure, how to recognize impatience before it was expressed, how to apologize for things that had not yet gone wrong. This, too, would later be called loyalty. The black woman aged differently. Her silence deepened. She became precise in her movements, deliberate in her expressions. She rarely looked directly at members of the white family unless addressed. But when she did speak, it was usually to redirect her children. Lower your voice. Step back. Not now. These corrections were gentle. They were also constant. Fear, when delivered consistently, does not feel like fear. It feels like caution. It feels like wisdom passed down. The white children absorbed their own lessons. They learned that the house responded to them. Doors opened, requests were fulfilled, mistakes were forgiven. When they raised their voices, something happened. When the black children raised theirs, something changed. This difference did not make them cruel, not immediately. It made them uncurious, and uncurious people rarely question systems that serve them. By the 1840s, the original black man died quietly in the room he had slept in for decades. His death caused inconvenience, not grief. The household paused briefly, adjusted duties, and continued. His name was not recorded in any ledger kept by the family, but his absence was felt immediately.
The younger black men stepped into his role seamlessly because they had been prepared to do so from childhood. This readiness was praised. "He's just like his father," the white family said, without irony. What they meant was, the system still works. The black children, now adults, had grown up knowing no other world. The fence was not a boundary to them, it was a horizon. Beyond it lay abstraction, stories, danger, chaos. Inside the house was order. Order had rules. Order had rewards. Order had consequences, but they were familiar. Freedom, by contrast, was undefined. Occasionally, visitors from nearby towns commented on the unusual closeness of the households. Some admired it. Some questioned it. One man, passing through in the late 1840s, asked a careless question at dinner. "Do they belong to you?" The room went quiet. The man of the house answered evenly, "They've been with us for a long time." This answer satisfied everyone. The black family heard it from the hallway. They did not discuss it later. By the 1850s, change was approaching the country, though the house pretended not to notice. Conversations about politics occurred behind closed doors. Newspapers arrived and were folded carefully, dangerous headlines hidden beneath safer ones. The black family noticed shifts in tone before they noticed words. Tension altered the air. Voices dropped. Instructions became firmer. And yet, nothing changed inside the house. That continuity was comforting. Children were born into both families. The newest generation of black children never heard the word slave spoken aloud. They did not need to. Their lives were structured around permission so absolute that the absence of it was unimaginable. They were not told they were owned. They were shown. By proximity, by expectation, by consequence. And by the time freedom became a concept spoken openly beyond the fence, the children inside the house had already learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that survival did not require escape. It required obedience. Freedom did not arrive at the house as an event. It arrived as a rumor. At first, it was something overheard, fragments carried in by visitors, half sentences spoken too loudly, newspapers folded too slowly. Words like emancipation and surrender appeared and disappeared without explanation. The White family discussed these things in private, with doors closed and voices lowered. The Black family heard everything anyway. They had learned long ago that silence did not prevent knowledge, it only delayed confirmation. When the war ended, the house did not celebrate. There was no mourning either. The man who now ruled the household adjusted his accounts, wrote letters, made plans. He was irritated more than anything else, irritated by uncertainty, by the intrusion of outside forces into a system he considered stable. The Black family waited. They were very good at waiting. Weeks passed before anyone addressed the matter directly. When it happened, it was done with the same calm tone used for all important announcements, measured, reasonable, framed as generosity. "You're free now," the man said one afternoon, standing near the doorway rather than sitting. "Things will be a little different." Different how, no one asked. The word free landed strangely. It did not settle. It did not attach itself to anything concrete. There were no instructions for how to use it, no examples, no destination attached. Freedom introduced without context is an abstraction, and abstractions are easy to ignore. Contracts were produced, simple documents written neatly, offering wages for continued work. Housing would remain provided, meals, as always, would be available. Stability was emphasized. The dangers of the outside world were mentioned casually, as if in concern rather than warning. "You know how things are out there, not safe for everyone." No one contradicted him. The Black adults could read the contracts. This fact was important. It would later be used as evidence of consent. They signed carefully, their handwriting precise, their expressions unreadable. No one left. This was the moment outsiders would later misunderstand. They would ask why. They would assume fear of retaliation, or ignorance, or laziness. They would imagine chains that no longer existed, threats that were never spoken. What they would miss was conditioning. The house had taught them everything except how to begin. The older Black woman, now a grandmother, felt the change most sharply, not because her circumstances shifted dramatically, but because the illusion shifted. The rules had been made visible. The house had acknowledged, however briefly, that another reality existed. That acknowledgement was unsettling. She began to watch her children and grandchildren more closely. She corrected them less. She allowed questions to go unanswered longer than before. She seemed, for the first time, uncertain. This uncertainty frightened her more than any punishment ever had. The younger generation reacted differently. The children born just before the war grew up hearing the word free spoken occasionally, though never explained. They knew it was important because adults grew quiet around it. They knew it was dangerous because it was never discussed openly. Freedom became something like weather, real, powerful, and entirely beyond their control. Occasionally, someone would leave the property and not return, a delivery man, a neighbor's relative, a stranger passing through. Each absence reinforced the same lesson. Leaving meant vanishing. The house remained. It fed them, sheltered them, defined them. Why abandon what had never failed them? By the early 1870s, the White family's authority had changed in tone, but not in function. They no longer spoke in the language of ownership. They spoke in the language of dependency. "We rely on each other," they said. "This arrangement works for everyone. You're better off here." These statements were not shouted. They were offered gently, often accompanied by favors, small privileges, minor kindnesses, moments of recognition. The Black family accepted them,
because acceptance had always been safer than refusal. The wages were modest but consistent. The money accumulated slowly, then was spent on necessities provided by the house itself. Independence, though technically possible, remained practically unreachable. This, too, would later be called choice. The outside world intruded again in the form of officials. A representative visited once, asking questions, recording names. The white family answered smoothly. The black family stood nearby, silent as ever. No one asked them directly what they wanted. When the official left, the house exhaled. After that, life resumed its familiar shape. Years passed. Children grew into adults who had never known bondage, yet had never known autonomy either. They worked because work was what days required. They stayed because staying was what generations had done. They did not dream of escape. They dreamed of continuity. By the late 1870s, the house had absorbed freedom the way it absorbed everything else, without changing its structure. The language had shifted. The reality had not. And this was the most dangerous outcome of all, because a system that survives its own abolition is no longer enforced from the outside. It is maintained from within.
Houses, like people, can survive only so long on memory. By the 1880s, the house was no longer what it had been. Its authority remained, but its confidence had thinned. Paint peeled where it once held. Floorboards softened under repeated steps. Repairs were delayed, then forgotten. What had once been called legacy was now simply maintenance. The White family felt the change first in small humiliations. Income dwindled. Investments failed quietly. Land was sold in parcels so small they were hardly noticed at first. Rooms were closed temporarily and never reopened. The house shrank inward. And as it did, it leaned more heavily on those who knew it best. The Black family had long since become its caretakers in every sense except name. They repaired what broke. They managed what remained. They remembered how things were done when the White family no longer did. This reversal was subtle enough to go unacknowledged. Dependence, when unspoken, preserves dignity. The White heirs, fewer now, less capable, spoke often of tradition, of keeping things as they were, of honoring the past. They said these things while relying entirely on the labor and knowledge of the people whose past they had never acknowledged. The Black family noticed the shift immediately. Authority no longer came with certainty. Instructions were vague. Decisions were postponed. Expectations remained absolute, but explanations disappeared. This is how power decays, not by vanishing, but by refusing responsibility. Children born into the Black family in these years inherited something new, not freedom, not fear exactly, but confusion. They were told they were free. They were treated as indispensable. They were paid barely. They were never encouraged to imagine elsewhere. The outside world crept closer. Roads improved. Towns expanded. Schools were built. People passed by the property who had no memory of slavery, no reverence for old houses. These passers-by noticed things. They noticed how the same faces appeared year after year, how no one ever seemed to leave, how children grew into adults without names changing in the town records. Questions were asked. The White family dismissed them politely. The Black family deflected them instinctively. Both sides had reasons. The White family feared scrutiny. The Black family feared disruption. Disruption had never ended well. Inside the house, roles hardened. The Black adults no longer asked permission for daily tasks, they simply acted. This autonomy was functional, not liberating. It existed only within the boundaries of the property. They knew what needed doing. They did it. Praise was rare. Criticism still found its way through. The house depended on them now, but dependence does not equal respect. It breeds resentment, quiet, corrosive.
By the 1890s, the original white authority had been reduced to title only. Decisions were reactive. Pride was brittle. The house clung to its identity long after its foundation had shifted. And the black family remained. Not because they were forced, not because they were ignorant, but because the house had shaped their sense of safety. Outside represented risk without instruction. Inside represented control without choice. That trade had been accepted generations ago. Children who had never seen the world beyond the fence heard stories of it anyway, fragments carried in by travelers, hints overheard during deliveries, cities, opportunities, lives not defined by one structure. These stories felt unreal, too large, too fast, too undefined. The house, for all its decay, was still comprehensible, and comprehension is seductive. An elderly black man, grandson of the first to arrive, once stood at the edge of the property longer than usual, watching a train pass in the distance. He did not move toward it. He did not wave. He simply watched until it disappeared. When asked later what he had been thinking, he answered honestly, "I was wondering where it goes." He did not say he wanted to follow. The house no longer punished curiosity. It didn't need to. Curiosity now died on its own. By the end of the century, the arrangement had become something no one had planned and no one knew how to end. The white family could not maintain the house alone. The black family could not imagine life without it. They were bound together by history, habit, and fear, not of each other, but of absence. The house had become a closed system, and closed systems do not collapse loudly. They suffocate slowly.
The new century arrived without ceremony. There were no banners, no speeches, no sense of renewal inside the house. Time moved forward because it always had. Calendars changed. Habits did not. By 1900, the house was no longer impressive, even to those who remembered its better years. It stood out not for what it was, but for what refused to change around it. Other estates modernized or disappeared. This one simply endured, quieter, smaller, more inward-looking. And still, the same families lived inside it. The black family now spanned generations that could not trace their origins beyond the house with any certainty. Names repeated, roles repeated, stories shortened with each telling until only fragments remained. There had once been a road before the house. There had once been fields beyond the fence. There had once been a time before. But memory without context becomes myth. The white family, reduced now to a few aging members and distant relatives, spoke rarely of the past. They spoke instead of necessity, of practicality, of how things were done. They no longer claimed benevolence. They claimed inevitability. It was during these years that outsiders finally began to look more closely. A schoolteacher passing through the area noticed that children from the house never appeared in her classroom. She inquired politely. She was told they were educated privately. This was said without defensiveness, as though the explanation were obvious. A doctor, called once to examine an elderly black woman near death, lingered longer than expected. He asked questions that were not strictly medical. Where had she been born? How long had she lived here? Her answers were vague, not because she meant them to be, but because precision had never been required of her before. The doctor hesitated when asked to sign the certificate. He did so eventually,
but he left with a sense of unease he could not articulate. Discomfort, like knowledge, is often postponed. Inside the house, life narrowed further. Rooms closed permanently, meals simplified. The Black family absorbed more responsibility without any formal shift in status. They managed accounts, oversaw repairs, spoke to merchants on behalf of the household. Still, they never spoke for themselves. The eldest Black woman, the last living person who remembered the years before freedom, sensed the end approaching. Not an end to the house, but an end to her role within it. Her body weakened. Her voice softened further. One evening, as she lay in the small room she had slept in most of her life, she spoke more than she had in years. Her granddaughter sat nearby, listening. "They used to say we stayed because we wanted to," the old woman said slowly. "That's not true." The granddaughter waited. "We stayed because we were raised not to know where else to stand." This was not said bitterly. It was said with clarity, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. She died that night. The house adjusted. Her absence was noted. Her duties were redistributed. Her words were not recorded. Life continued. In the years that followed, the world outside moved faster. Laws changed. Attitudes shifted. People spoke openly about freedom as something inherited, assumed, unquestioned. Inside the house, freedom remained theoretical. By 1910, the arrangement had become so normalized that no one inside thought to challenge it, and no one outside felt confident enough to intervene. There was no crime to prosecute, no chains to point to, no bruises to photograph. Only patterns. Patterns are difficult to dismantle, especially when they are quiet. Eventually, the house did change. It had to. Estates always do. It passed into other hands. Records scattered. Names faded. What remained was not scandal. It was silence. And silence, unlike violence, leaves no clear evidence. Only questions. Why did they stay? Why did no one leave? Why did no one stop it? The house did not answer. It never had.